Hey, future PTAs. Hope you guys are doing well. Today we're going to talk about cognition, emotion, memory, and language. So there is our outline with cognition and emotion. Cognition is your ability to think, plan, and solve problems. It requires focus, concentration, attention, and working memory. Your working memory is like your ability to hold a thought in the front of your brain. Your emotions are your feelings and reactions that occur in response to thoughts, beliefs, or experiences. Both internal processes that others can't access unless you display them externally. So your emotional centers are closely linked with cranial nerves that control facial muscles. And both cognition and emotions are centered in the association areas of your brain. Brain injuries, such as like stroke, a traumatic brain injury, a tumor, can all damage parts of the brain responsible for cognition and or emotions, and they could cause you to display deficits in both of these areas. Cognition, so there are association areas on the lateral and anterior portions of both of the hemispheres of the brain. Your cognitive cortex, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, allows for intellectual function, which includes planning ahead, anticipating consequences, exercising judgment, displaying reasoning, and analytical thinking and problem solving. Your cognition allows you to shift your thoughts and behavior from one topic or reaction to another. It gives us the ability to focus on a problem, consider a solution, and choose a course of action. The prefrontal cortex is the area responsible for inhibition of inappropriate or potentially dangerous impulses, and it's the last part of the brain to mature. So again, this is something that's not fully matured or developed in teenagers, which is why teenagers may be a little more impulsive or more quick to do something without thinking about the consequences. Cognitive cortex, it receives information from the somatosensory association cortex, the auditory association cortex, the visual association cortex, and the thalamus. And it integrates the input from all those different sources and formulates an appropriate response. So it's got a lot of moving parts, a lot of information coming all together and making sense of that. Damage to the cognitive cortex could cause difficulty focusing, concentrating, or following directions. Some of the common things associated with the damaged frontal lobe are confusion, disorientation, and perseveration. So perseveration is when you like get stuck on one thing, you're not able to shift your attention to a new topic, but you keep kind of spiraling and doing or saying the same things over and over. This is a common thing you see with people who've had a traumatic brain injury, specifically to the front of their brain or the cognitive cortex. Prefrontal syndrome, usually this is after a brain injury. The patient may display certain behaviors like excessive agitation, lack of self-control. They may do things or say things that are socially inappropriate, all because of damage to the prefrontal cortex. They're typically impulsive. They have a low inhibition, so not much of a sensor or a stopping mechanism and difficulty concentrating. So I had a friend in college that got in a motorcycle accident and damaged the frontal lobe and was in a coma for a while. Once he got out of the coma, his filter was gone. You know, if he thought something, he would say it. If he felt like doing something, he did it. You know, it was like that area between when a thought enters your mind and actually doing it was just gone. He just did whatever was in his mind. It did improve as he healed and got better over the years, but for a while he was pretty impulsive. Treatment recommendations for this population. So you want to have a very scheduled and appropriate environment with minimizing distractions. You want to make the goals attainable with some quick positive reinforcement or feedback. They need to be functional as possible. A lot of people, when they're agitated, if you're telling them to do, you know, bicep curls or something, they are not going to do it. But if you say, reach, grab your cup, now take a drink, then they see the reward in that. They see the purpose in that. And so the more functional, the more likely they are to do something and the less likely they are to get agitated. I had a patient with a brain injury that I kept saying, let's go for a walk. And he's like, I ain't going for no walk. And then I'm like, do you need to go to the bathroom? He's like, and then I was like, let's walk to the bathroom. So then I got him to walk, and on the way to the bathroom, he forgot where he was going. So he walked down the hallway and went further and got a, pretty significant walk in. But being that it was functional, he was okay with it, but not understanding what I was asking him to do increased the agitation. The therapist needs to stay calm. Again, a lot of these patients become agitated, confused, frustrated, saying or doing inappropriate things. And we have control of our prefrontal cortex, and so we need to maintain that control and be the calm presence in that environment. Give really clear and concise cues. Don't over speak or over cue somebody. Just say, walk faster or stand up, not next we're going to scoot up, lean forward, nose over your toes, and all these extra cues that are going to be confusing. Just as basic as possible. Frequent reassurance and reorientation is common. A lot of times they don't have a lot of awareness of their injury or their deficits. And so reminding them, your legs are weak, be careful, or something may be important throughout your session. Something to think about, another little clinical nugget is back in the day, they used to do a prefrontal lobotomy. So people who came in with significant mental health problems, especially those that cause them to be aggressive or violent, then they would go put a metal instrument in either through the top of their eye, like their orbital, sometimes even through the nose, and they would cut certain neurons that connect the thalamus to the prefrontal cortex. And the goal was to keep them from being aggressive, but the outcome was basically completely killing their personality. The person would be very apathetic and be a completely different person oftentimes after that procedure. That started kind of in the 1930s. In the 50s, the antipsychotic medications were introduced, and those had a lot better effects with a lot less side effects. And so the 1970s was the last time that surgery was performed in the United States. Emotion. So emotional centers are mainly located in the medial aspect of the cerebral cortex, what we call the emotional cortex or the limbic system. It contains the orbitofrontal cortex, inferotemporal cortex, cingulate gyrus, parts of the temporal lobe like the hippocampus and the amygdala, and it plays a key role in your emotions and in your memories. With your emotional cortex, it's critical for cognition, for behavior. It's responsible for social behaviors, emotional responses, preferences. It connects your sensory association areas related to smell, smell and taste, and brain regions that interpret physiological information. So there's a lot of connections there. That's why sometimes you have a smell and you're like, oh, that reminds me of my grandma, or oh, that reminds me of when I broke my thumb. Super random. But emotions can activate the autonomic nervous system as well. So that's why when you're stressed or you're nervous, your heart rate and your respiratory rate might go up, your blood pressure may go up, you might start sweating or trembling, or if you're really scared, all of those things can happen as well. Your emotional cortex is also closely connected to parts of the brain responsible for physiological responses to danger, to stress, and your drives, your hunger, your thirst, your sex drive. All of those are closely associated to the emotional cortex. That's why people stress eat or stress not eat. The emotional cortex also integrates different signals and communicates them to the cognitive cortex, which then integrates your emotions to your decision-making process. So you don't just respond with anger, you can actually control that if you so choose. Recognizing emotions. Emotions are a subjective internal experience. We can recognize other emotions by facial expressions or their tone of voice, by their gestures or other physical behaviors. A lot of people with autism spectrum disorder have a tough time reading people's emotions. Empathy is an observation of another's emotions, producing similar feelings within us. It's produced by mirror neurons in the cerebral cortex that, again, help us recognize the emotions in others and then care about those emotions. Emotion or cognitive, the emotion and cognition, sorry, connections between the emotional cortex and cognitive cortex go in both directions. So emotions can inform our decisions and our thinking can modify our emotions. So by thinking, we could calm ourselves down, or our emotions could, drive certain thoughts. These connections and the connections to the hypothalamus create physiological reactions to our decisions. Damage to the emotional cortex may produce a flat affect or an exaggerated emotional response. And it could also cause a lack of empathy. It could cause impulsive behaviors without considering consequences, and cause changes in personality. The authors of our textbook explain that our gut feeling is our emotional brain that guides our behaviors, our choices, our preferences, and over 90% of our serotonin is actually produced in our gut. So gut health is actually very key to mental health. It's very connected. Learning and memory. Learning is the process of acquiring memory. Memory is the result of a learning process, and almost everything humans know and do is learned. Learning is based on structural changes that occur in neurons and their synapses or connections. Neuroplasticity is the term we use to describe these changes. It describes the flexibility or the adaptability available to our brains. The brain can reorganize its neural connections and change its physical structure based on experiences. So when you are having certain experiences and you're thinking in certain patterns of thought, you're actually changing the structure of your brain. Something that I learned and worked on for several years of my life was this, they call it neurocycling, but where you have certain patterns of thinking that just aren't helpful to you and you don't want to get stuck in those patterns anymore. And you go through and you think about those thoughts and you think of the root of those thoughts and you like picture like you're digging up a tree because the neurons actually look like a tree. And you decide what thoughts you want to plant in that place and you feed those thoughts. And so the more the negative thoughts come in and you replace them with the positive thoughts and you replace them with things that could actually benefit your life and not things that are just tearing you down, then the more your brain actually changes and starts to pay more attention to and kind of feed and grow those positive thoughts. So actually only 5% of our brain is dedicated to negative thinking, but somebody who's a true pessimist continues to really focus on those negative thoughts, and they can grow that part of their brain to where a larger percentage of their brain is dedicated to negative thinking. And the same is true about the opposite. If you decide, I'm naturally a pessimist, but I am going to be intentional about every time I think of a bad thing about today, I'm going to think of 3 things I'm thankful for. I'm going to, focus on the positive. Then you can actually grow those centers of your brain so that your brain naturally starts thinking of more and more of the positive things. So it's just really beautiful how we actually have control over our brain. Our brain doesn't fully control us. Hippocampal lesions. So injury to the hippocampus can cause difficulty learning and memory deficits. The hippocampus is one of the few brain regions that actually can regenerate. So some of the things that cause the hippocampus to shrink are traumatic brain injuries, Alzheimer's, chemotherapy, chronic depression, chronic stress. They all make it shrink and make it harder to learn. However, there are things like psychotherapy, medication, movement, exercise that actually have been shown to reverse that hippocampus shrinkage so that you're able to feed that area of the brain, grow that area, and learn better again once you're out of that stressful environment or once you are, um, you know, done with your chemotherapy or whatnot. Declarative learning and memory. So these are memories that can be described in words. We also call it explicit learning and memory. Things like phone numbers, addresses, dates, events, very specific memories you could write down and share with somebody. Facts, figures, those are all semantic memories. And then episodic memories are your kind of internal diary of life and your experiences. Um, these are strongly enhanced by emotional significance. So somebody is more likely to remember a really good or really bad day in their life than they are to remember last Tuesday at 4 o'clock, when just nothing significant happened. The more emotional connection we have to memory, the more vivid and strong that connection is. Non-declarative learning and memory, which is also called implicit learning and memory. It's hard to express in words. It's hard to explain. It does include emotional responses. It includes motor skills. It includes habits. It's kind of the things that you start and you learn, and then you kind of put on autopilot and do without really even thinking about it. Sometimes there's a cognitive component, but a lot of times as we practice it more, it becomes more and more automatic. So it's kind of like, when you get in the shower and your mind is on something else and you come out of the shower, and I don't know if you've ever done this, but you think, did I wash my hair? I don't remember if I washed my hair because it was so automatic. You just really didn't put your mind was somewhere else and you didn't put really any thought into it. Stages of declarative learning. So there are 4 stages: acquisition, consolidation, storage, and retrieval. With acquisition, this is when you're acquiring the new knowledge, you're actively engaged in the process, and your prefrontal cortex is very active. So you're putting a lot of mind power into that. With consolidation, the knowledge becomes encoded into your existing neural circuits. The activity of the hippocampus is more active on the left with verbal learning, and on the right with spatial memories. With the storage stage, the learning behaviors or whatever you're learning is stored in specific association areas of the cerebral cortex based on the information. So if it's visual, it's stored in the visual association area. If it's auditory, it's stored in the auditory association area. And then retrieval is the ability to access or remember what you have learned. It requires activation of the prefrontal cortex and the association areas and them working together. During the consolidation phase, when you're really like putting those things into memory and just kind of encoding them into your brain, then you can actually learn better if you sleep more, if you exercise, if you repeat what you're learning over and over. That's why it's important to learn things over time and not cram before a test, because you don't actually switch it from acquisition stage to the storage and retrieval stage. It just kind of stays in your working memory and you dump it on a test and then don't remember it again. It's believed that repetitive firing of synapses during dreaming also helps provide repetition for consolidation. So sometimes studying right before bedtime can help because your brain actually is rehearsing that while you sleep. Memories that are seldom accessed tend to fade over time, and those frequently accessed become stronger. So if you learn a language, for example, I learned French in middle school, never have done anything with French. I could probably say hi, bye, and please in French. And then learned Spanish in high school, worked on it in college. By the end of college, I was like, understanding a lot of Spanish and able to respond. And now I have not really accessed that much in my adult life. And so I can't probably speak or understand hardly any. So the more you want to, remember stuff, you need to retrieve it over and over. As I mentioned, sleep, exercise, meaningful focus, and repetition all help enhance your memory. It's actually recommended to make your study sessions short, focused, and active to improve what you learn. So rather than just saying, here's 8 hours, I'm going to sit and study all day, maybe here's 30 minutes, and then I'm going to get up and go put a load of clothes in the laundry, and then I'm going to come back and do 30 minutes, and I'm going to go for a walk, and just breaking it up to really short focus sessions with some activities and things in between. Phases of motor learning, we have acquisition, storage, and access. So acquisition is when all of the motor areas of the brain and spinal cord are active during this phase. You must practice a skill to acquire it. Some of these areas we're talking about is the primary motor cortex, cerebellum, basal ganglia, prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is actually where the motivation to learn and the ability to pay attention and focus are all housed. So that's one of the important areas in actually going from just trying something and then actually learning and excelling at it. Storage is where you retain the skill as a motor memory. And then access is all motor regions of the brain except the premotor cortex must be active to retrieve the memory. So essentially, after you've ridden a bike for years, you can ride the bike and all the other areas of the brain are active, but the premotor cortex, is not having to think about it. And so you can think about other things. You can be, I don't know what you can do while you're riding a bike besides like talk and sing and listen to music and think. But if you're good at riding with no hands, maybe you could do something with your hands while you're riding a bike because you can use that premotor cortex for something else. The access point is when you are able to retrieve the memory automatically while your mind's on something else. Many people call this muscle memory, but it's not really stored in the muscles. It's stored in the supplementary motor areas of the frontal lobe. And it can be stored almost indefinitely. The only way that memory is usually lost is if there is some type of injury to the supplementary motor area of the brain. And then that would cause difficulty with performing sequenced, planned motor activities. I will say, though, as you age, your mind still knows how to do it, but your body may not be able to. So just because you could do a back handspring in middle school does not mean, and I can tell you this from experience, that after you have kids, you can suddenly do a back handspring again. Your brain thinks you can, and it still remembers how, but your body just ain't there. So just be careful with that. All right, short-term memories. Learning can be short-term, it's learned and forgotten, or long-term where it's retained. Your working memory lasts just from a few seconds to a memory, whereas your true short-term memory lasts minutes to days. Sorry, I meant to say working memory, seconds to minutes, not to memory. So short-term memories, there's working memory, seconds to minutes, and that's correlated with intelligence, the ability to just hold stuff in your brain. Somebody says a bunch of information and you're able to just spout it back out. The short-term memories typically fade unless they have a strong emotional component or they're rehearsed over and over. The neurobiology of short-term memory. So memory relies on biological changes in synapses that already exist in the central nervous system. As we learn, synapses are fired repeatedly, strengthening and becoming more and more sensitive. Sensitization is as the synapse strengthen, more neurotransmitters and synaptic vessels are put into their axon terminals and more receptors are available to receive their signals. If the pathways stop being activated, then the synapses will return to their resting state and the memories will be lost. So we are firing over and over, which is why we need to repeat it over and over to keep firing and actually move that from short-term to long-term memory. With the neurobiology of the long-term memory, it involves creating new synapses, which is called synaptogenesis, and that requires synapses that are fired repeatedly in acquisition stage of learning. So once you repeat it over and over and over, you create new synapses that keep it in your brain so you can access it later. With enough activation over a period of days or weeks, not just one night studying, genes in the pre and postsynaptic neurons will be expressed or activated. These genes cause those new synapses to form. And then if the existing synapses aren't fired long enough, they will be pruned and decay over time. So that's why the show Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader is out. Because when you learned in fifth grade that you haven't accessed since fifth grade, it's probably going to be way back there and probably decayed or completely pruned and cut out of your mind. When glutamate is the neurotransmitter involved in synaptogenesis, repeated firing causes large sustained flow of calcium that jumpstarts activation of this synaptic gene. So if you want to know a little more about the physiology behind that, there is that. Amnesia, memory loss after a traumatic injury to the brain. Retrograde amnesia is where you can't remember events before the injury. Most of the time, as the patient heals, those memories start to return. But in most cases, the details surrounding the injury itself are rarely recalled. Anterograde amnesia is where you can't remember what has happened since the injury occurred. So the person is confused or disoriented. They're having trouble just figuring out what's going on. They don't know that they're injured. They don't know that there was a accident, and they keep needing to be reoriented to what's going on. This typically fades as the patient heals as well, but the longer it takes to fade, the more severe the traumatic brain injury is. So it's kind of a cue. How long it takes to fade is a cue of where they're going to end up with the healing process, their prognosis. Alzheimer's disease is a loss of cognitive and memory function. It's the leading cause of dementia. The short-term memories are the first to fade, and then eventually the long-term memories gradually fade. The brain actually displays a loss of nerve cells. It displays tangles, plaques. The brain is smaller in size and lighter than a healthy brain. The ventricles and the basically dead space in the brain are larger compared to a healthy brain. The damage typically begins in the temporal lobe and then spreads throughout the cerebral cortex. Damage to the hippocampus and amygdala cause a lot of difficulty remembering faces, loss of spatial memory, so it's really easy to get lost and turned around, and oftentimes aggressive behaviors. Now, there are some medicines that can temporarily improve cognitive function, but currently there's no medicine that slows or stops the progression of the disease. And for a true diagnosis of Alzheimer's, although a lot of people are diagnosed when they're alive, to truly confirm it, you would need to do an autopsy and look at the brain to see if it has those plaques and tangles and that smaller size. Language, so this involves hearing and understanding speech, and then the ability to formulate words, organizing them into sentences, and the ability to read and write. All of those are included in language. There is receptive and expressive speech, and both of those are mainly on the left hemisphere. So when we say left language, that's what we think of. Nonverbal communication is in corresponding locations on the right side of the brain. So your verbal communication or your written oral communication left, and then on the right side is that nonverbal communication. Here are some of the language areas of the brain. So remember the temporal lobe and the auditory cortex and auditory association areas all help with hearing and with processing and with language. The Wernicke's area is for receptive language, what you're hearing and processing. Damage to that area makes it hard to understand written or spoken language, which is receptive aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia. And then the Broca's area is your expressive language, your ability to form words and sentences and to speak and communicate that way. It has many connections with the supplementary motor cortex, where motor speech programs are stored, and the primary motor cortex that controls your muscles to produce speech. Damage to that area would lead to expressive aphasia or Broca's aphasia, where somebody could understand what's being told to them, but they cannot think clearly or be able to speak normally. So they may have the ability to think of what they need to say, but they can't produce it. Oftentimes they have a limited amount of words, or they might say the same word over and over, or what comes out is just not actual words. Global aphasia is both, where the person has difficulty producing and understanding speech because both the Wernicke's and the Broca's areas are damaged. As I mentioned on the last slide, it's very cool how on the left side of the brain you have these specific areas for communication, and then on the right side you have very similar places in the brain that are dedicated to nonverbal communication. So where Wernicke's area is, because that is your ability to understand speech, on the right side where that Wernicke's is your ability to understand nonverbal communication. And then with the left side, there's Broca's area with your ability to produce speech or produce language. And on the right side, where that Broca's area would be, is a portion of your brain dedicated to producing your nonverbal communication, your facial expressions, your gestures, all of that. Some people actually have speech areas on both sides of their brain. All right, that is it for today. I hope you've learned something. And if you have questions, just let me know. And I will see you guys next time.